thanks very much to the organizers for giving me a chance to talk about these very important issues. What I'm going to do now is talk a bit about SNSI, just so we all know a bit about the organization. Of course, you can always go to the website to get more information about that. Then I'm going to talk about research integrity issues in publishing in general. Then I have a screen that talks about the specific issues in research integrity on what I refer to as piracy websites. And then I'll end with solutions. So if we go to the next screen. So for background here, SNSI, the Scholarly Network Security Initiative, was formed in 2020 by journal publishers. It now includes about 15 organizations. Those are they're all publisher organizations, but they range from university presses to society publishers to commercial publishers as well. We also include in the various work streams technology and library professionals who work with us on particular projects or particular presentations. And the goal of SNSI is to really deal holistically with the development of websites that have unauthorized content on them. That's why I refer to them as piracy websites. And that includes Sci-Hub, which is perhaps the best known of these, LibGen, ZLibrary, and his archive, and then the more recent Super Pirate site service, which has set itself up in the past year. Now, in my view, many of these are connected. In fact, it's possible that all of them are connected. Anna's archive, for example, seems to be a clone of Sci-Hub content, if you like. And they all have some type of Russian state connections or Russian actor connections to them. And I will note here on the right, by the way, I have a reference list on the last slide with some of the postings and articles that I will mention. The little window here on the right is a warning from the City of London IP Police from 2021 about the dangers of accessing such websites to download content. And the primary reason for that concern is the possibility of malign actions, insecure actions that might take place outside of the question of downloading or uploading content. There's also possibility of phishing attacks and the like. So that was a very important warning from 2021. Now, the piracy websites work by encouraging voluntary donations. That can be, of course, content or access to content, such as information about email addresses and the like, and also cryptocurrency. They actively seek such funding and they actually contribute cryptocurrency funds to other actions and other actors. And of course, they rely on the rather insecure IP address authentication protocols that scholarly publishers and research libraries, started using more than 20 years ago now as an easy way for a researcher in a particular institution that has subscription access to be able to access that content from the publisher's site. This is not the kind of two-factor authentication or clear identification of users, passwords, and that kind of thing that we have become now more accustomed to in our personal lives that are improvements on ways of accessing information. Now, we believe that the website operators or their allies or people that rely on these sites also scrape data themselves. And one of the reasons for the concerns of the City of London IP Police was the possibility that university research content itself, in addition to personal information, could be the targets of, if you will, the hackers that are either behind or are using such sites. So this is more than just publications. And I think we all will remember the British Library ransomware attack of October 2023, which took some time for the library to manage and clean their sites. That was reported to be a phishing attack on temporary contract workers' accessibility. I'm not asserting that it was connected to Sci-Hub, but it is an indication, it's an example of the insecure problems and the problems that might arise from dealing with such sites. Now, I mentioned the holistic approach which SNSI has been taking. And the reason for that is I think we realize that this is not purely a legal matter. We can file legal cases and seek site blocking in particular countries, but many of these organizations operate outside of kind of Western standard rule of law countries. So it can be quite difficult to get to them. So we also think about technology, tools, and guidelines, and we also focus very much on the educational side of university relations and our communications team. So our website, for example, has many guidelines, citations, and references. Our university relations team goes out to library events and conferences and presents on these issues. So I'd like to turn to the next slide now and talk about the research integrity issues generally in publishing. I think most of us will be aware of the idea that the number of retractions has been increasing over the past 5, 10 years. And that has been, as a matter of reporting and as a matter of kind of looking at publisher websites, you'll see much more information about retractions. When I first started, so many years ago now, we were dealing with perhaps dozens of retraction issues per year at Elsevier, where I was then working. Now, the recent article that you'll see in the reference list on the last page says that there's about 1,000 retractions per year in the period 2003 to 2022. Now, of course, we do have occasional uh, blips. So we have the Wiley Hindawi special issues issue that came up was reported in 2023. That was about 8,000 retractions. And Springer Nature itself just announced a set of retractions, about 3,000 in 2024. So it does beg this question of, are we simply experiencing more ethical violations, or are we getting better at detecting problems in the literature? And I think most people would probably say, as I do, that the answer is probably both. We do have improvements. We have better methods. We have better detection. So that definitely helps us. On the other hand, sometimes there are fraudsters who are working the angles on new types of ethical violations and ethical problems. So it's really kind of a combination of both. Now, the improvements that we have seen are we have clearer policies on the publisher side and also on the library and society side. We have better educating services, better communicating, better testing. So, for example, there's plagiarism detection, which is widely available now. We also have the development of integrity teams, better and larger integrity teams at publishers, but also at research universities themselves, and more communication, I think, between those integrity teams. And then finally, we have whistleblowers. So probably one of the earliest formal whistleblower was the Retraction Watch folks. That's Adam Marcus and Ivan Aransky there on the right, who started Retraction Watch in 2010, focusing on a whole host of issues. Helpfully, Retraction Watch also publishes lists of various kinds of retraction issues, and it's always good reading. We also have the newer whistleblower, Elizabeth Bike, from the Netherlands, who started off looking at the question of image manipulation in particular, although she now looks at other issues in addition to images. And then we have Graham Kendall, who has been taking a look at predatory journals. Now, predatory journals are essentially fake or fraudulent journals that attempt to convince a researcher to part with an open access fee, perhaps, in essentially a fake journal. You should always test and verify these things. So take a look at DOAJ and see if the journal in question is actually listed as an open access journal. Now, I would say that of these issues, the most serious really are data and image manipulation. And of course, in science publishing, image is the same thing as data, I would say. And the reason for that is that it suggests that the underlying data in the paper, or at least some of the underlying data, shouldn't be relied on, shouldn't be cited in further papers, shouldn't be used as part of the stream of research activity. You can make an argument that there are problems with authorship disputes and plagiarism and the like, and those are all serious. I don't discount them, but it's the data manipulation that I think is the most problematic. We do have the new issues that have come up, such as the predatory journals, but we also have a relatively recent phenomenon, the paper mill, which is a shoddy sort of paper that kind of looks like a scientific paper, and in which researchers are offered the possibility of being identified for a fee as a co-author. And those are then submitted to different places. Hopefully they're generally rejected by serious journals. I think a good example of the data problem are the COVID retractions, which Retraction Watch tracks. And there are now, of course, over 500 of those. You may remember that some of the editorial policies at some journals and preprint servers were relaxed or sped up during the height of the COVID emergency to try to get more information out more quickly, very understandable in that kind of emergency. But now, of course, quite a few have been retracted as really lacking in quality or lacking in data. Probably the most famous of these is the, what's it called, hydroxychloroquine thing from the quote unquote lab that was then run by Didier Raoult. That came up during the RFK Jr. Hearing about his new role at HHS in the States. Another issue that I think is very important is what I think of as the downstream issue. So Retraction Watch tracks citations of retracted articles. And if you look at their list and look at the top 10 list, you will see that there are actually a lot of citations that happen post-retraction. So think about this. These are papers that have clearly been retracted in the literature, and yet some researchers and users are citing them not as examples of retractions, but purportedly relying on the data that was reported in those papers. Take a look at the next slide now. So piracy websites and retractions. There's a great Taylor and Francis article just published in January that took a look at retracted articles on Sci-Hub. What they did is they took a look at 17,000 papers that are marked as retracted in Scopus or in Web of Science between 2002 and 2022. So there are 17,000 papers that they were looking at that they then cross-checked on Sci-Hub. What they found is 85% of the articles on Sci-Hub had no retraction information on them. So again, if a researcher is relying on Sci-Hub as a valid research resource, they would be sadly mistaken. And I think we have to understand that there is a question about what the motivation of these types of sites are. I have the advisory noted here on Russian state actors. That's not specifically as to these sites, but we also know that there are malign actors We have DeepSeek, the Chinese AI service using Anna's archive, for example. My view of this is that these websites want to appear to have enough mass to be viewed as comprehensive, and which enables then some of these malign actions to take place. So, again, user beware, know who you are dealing with. And of course, the problems with this is that if you are thinking about these sources as a good resource, again, you have to be concerned about bad data. Think of the COVID papers, for example, and you have to be concerned about the further downstream pollution that we see with referencing and citation of retracted papers. So next slide, I talk a bit about some solutions here. And I think the first and most important is probably education. Again, it's know who you're talking about, know who you're dealing with. And I do think today's event is part of that, but also some of the presentations that SNSI is involved with on library conferences and the like. And I also think, I hope that part of the message here is that these are educational points to raise back in your community, back at your university, perhaps at your publishing house or society, to further inform folks, again, to the basic mantra, be careful who you're dealing with. There are better technical solutions to access protocols, and Matt will speak about the Open Athens solutions coming up, or some portion of it. And there are better bibliographic and technology tools to identify retracted content. And we need people to be more aware of those, to use DOJ, for example, for predatory journals. And then finally, on the legal side, of course, we do seek to block or limit access to piracy sites. And we do have site blocks initiated in many countries. So those are some of the solutions I see, and I'm very happy to entertain questions.
Thank you very much, Mark, for taking us through that. We do have a question in the Q&A. Could you share the references to the papers that were mentioned during the presentation? Is there a place where viewers can go to see those?
Yeah, so I have a list of the references on the last page of the slide PowerPoint.
Fantastic. That's
And
great
if
stuff.
anyone has any questions about this, I'm happy to give more information.
Brilliant. Okay. So I'm just making sure that there's nothing. Oh, so there is another one here. So
Something in chat.
yeah, I've also got a question in the Q&A. So do you see IP access as a part of the problem? So should we all be moving to federated access such as Open Athens?
So I absolutely do. I think loose security methods are an invitation to misuse, and they are an easy way for malign actors to improperly access all sorts of things in places that they should not be accessing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. And yeah, just one eye on the chat. So one of our viewers is currently working on research integrity tools for students, and they don't think that blocking anything is the right way to solve a problem. I don't know if you've they go on to say that piracy websites are now showing retractions. That the fact that websites are showing retractions is interesting, but they're not sure if universities would use the tools if they worked on piracy websites. So I don't know if you've got any further comment to make on that.
Well, I mean, clearly, I don't believe that using piracy websites as a research reference source is a good idea. That should be obvious from my presentation. So I think there are plenty other resources to use. I mean, we have preprint servers, we have PubMed. There's a lot of stuff out there. You don't have to use a publisher website, although as a former publisher, I think there's a good reason to, but that's perhaps my personal background or prejudice.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark.